Chapter 18, Part 1 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Penfold. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 18, Part 1. The Wars for Armenia, under Claudius and Nero. The struggle between Rome and Parthia for the possession of Armenia was renewed in the reign of Claudius. This struggle was perpetually being decided, and perpetually reoccurring. The Romans were determined to keep their hold over a country which was a ground of vantage for either realm against the other, while the Parthian monarchs tried, whenever they got an opportunity, to supplant Roman influence and reduce the land to dependence on themselves. Warlike demonstrations on the part of Rome were generally sufficient to make the Parthian kings withdraw their pretensions to Armenia and adopt a respectful attitude to the Roman emperor. For they were constantly hampered by wars on other frontiers of their dominion, and by domestic dissensions. These repeated settlements of the Armenian question are marked by the same general features. Rival pretenders to the throne of Armenia are supported by Rome and Parthia. The Parthian kingdom is distracted by civil war or excited into discontent against the reigning monarch, and there is a movement in favour of some scion of the Arsacid house who is living in exile or as a hostage at Rome. He is supported by Roman arms, but by an inevitable reaction is soon rejected, and the war ends with the acknowledgment of Roman supremacy in some form in Armenia. It will be remembered that Tiberius had established the overlordship of Rome in 20 B.C., that it was again confirmed by Gaius Caesar in 2 A.D. Again in 18 A.D., the Parthians submitted at the appearance of another presumptive heir to the empire, and recently the energetic action of Lucius Vitellius had thwarted the schemes of Artabanus III. But what had been well done under the auspices of Tiberius was immediately undone by the caprice of his successor. Gaius summoned Mithridates, the new king of Armenia, to Rome, deposed him, and sent him into exile. At the same time he recalled Vitellius in disgrace from his government of Syria. This was an opportunity for the Parthians, and they did not fail to seize the coveted land. Thus, when Claudius came to the throne, one of the tasks which devolved upon him was the recovery of Armenia. Mithridates was immediately recalled from exile, and, restored to his royal dignity, he set about recovering his kingdom with the help of his brother Pharasmanes, king of Iberia. Artabanus III was now dead, and Parthia was disturbed by a war for the succession between his sons Gotarzes and Vardanes. Gotarzes had come to the throne, and made himself detested by his cruelties. One of his acts was the murder of his brother Artabanus with his wife and son. His subjects accordingly sent for his other brother Vardanes, an enterprising prince, who was then at a distance of 400 miles from the court. He is said to have traversed this space in 2 days, and Gotarzes, completely surprised and terrified, fled. Seleucia alone, which had held out against his father, declined the rule of Vardanes, and the new king was impolitic enough to give way to his resentment at such a moment, and embarrass himself with the siege of a city secured by strong fortifications and abundant supplies. He thus gave Gotarzes time to collect an army of Hyrcanians and Dahae, Scythian races east of the Caspian Sea, and was then compelled to raise the siege and march against his brother. He pitched his camp on the great Bactrian plain, which stretches between the Oxus and the Parapamesus, now the Hindu Kush. It was a favourable moment for Mithridates to re-establish his rule in Armenia, and the Armenians made no resistance when their governor, who had ventured on a battle, was slain. Some of the nobles inclined to Cotys, king of Little Armenia, but a letter from his overlord Claudius prevented that monarch from interfering. Some of the fortresses of Armenia received Roman garrisons. Meanwhile the armies of the Parthian brothers had met, but just as they were about to begin battle, they came suddenly to an agreement, through the discovery of a plot which Gotarzes revealed to his brother. They joined right hands, and Gotarzes yielded the sovereignty to his brother, and, to avoid rivalry, retired into the wilds of Hyrcania. Vardanes was then able to force Seleucia, which had defied the Parthian government for 7 years, to capitulate. 43 A.D. After this success he was preparing to invade Armenia, but was deterred by the threatening attitude of Vibius Marsus, the legatus of Syria. The struggle with Gotarzes soon broke out anew. That prince repented of his renunciation of the crown, and was urged by the discontented nobility to take up arms again. The conflict took place in the country between the Caspian and Herat, and Vardanes gained a great victory, and pushed his successes as far as the borders of the Dahé. He returned haughtier and more intolerable to his subjects than ever. A plot was concerted, and he was assassinated when he was intent upon the chase. 45 A.D. He was still in his first youth, but he would deserve, says the historian Tacitus, to be ranked among the few greatest of even long-lived kings, if he had sought to be loved by his subjects as he sought to be feared by his enemies. Gotarzes immediately assumed the sovereignty, but after some years his cruelty and profligacy drove the Parthians to send an embassy to Rome and beg that the prince Meherdates, the surviving son of Vonones, whom Germanicus had put to death in Cilicia, should be sent to dispute the Parthian throne with the hated Gotarzes. 49 A.D. The ambassadors represented that Parthia sent her king's sons as hostages to Rome, in order that when she grew tired of her own government, she might fall back on the emperor and the senate, and obtain a better king trained in Roman manners. Claudius improved the occasion by emphasizing the superiority of Rome and the submissiveness of the Parthians. He did not lose the opportunity of comparing himself to the divine Augustus, from whom the Parthians in like manner had sought a king, Vonones. But he omitted all reference to his uncle Tiberius, who had sent 2 kings to Parthia. He gave good advice to Meherdates, who was present, urging him to consider himself as a ruler among freemen, not as a despot among slaves. The barbarians will like clemency and justice all the more, because they are unused to them. Then turning to the ambassadors, he dwelled on the virtues of the young foster-child of Rome. Yet, even if his character should change, "It is well that subjects should bear with the caprices of kings. Frequent revolutions are unprofitable. Rome has now reached such a height that she can afford to wish that even foreign peoples should enjoy repose." As L. Vitellius had formerly conducted Tiridates to the frontiers of the Parthian empire, so it devolved now upon C. Cassius, governor of Syria, to escort Meherdates to the Euphrates. There he was received by several Parthian potentates, including King Abgar of Osrhoene. Cassius gave the young prince sound advice, showing him that delay would be fatal, and that if he did not act quickly, the enthusiasm of the barbarians would soon flag. But Meherdates was induced by Abgar to amuse himself for several days in Edessa, and then, instead of occupying Mesopotamia, where success seems to have been assured to him by Carenes, the governor of Mesopotamia, he proceeded by a circuitous route to Armenia, where, as winter was beginning, it was impossible to do much. He was joined by Carenes, and then advancing along the Tigris into Adiabene, whose king Izates pretended to espouse his cause, he occupied the historic site of Ninus, and gave it the name of Colonia Nini Claudia. Delay was fatal to Meherdates, even as it had been fatal to Tiridates, the pretender sent by Tiberius. His chief adherents, recognizing his incompetence, especially Abgar and Izates, deserted to Gotarzes, and then he decided to risk everything on a battle. The struggle seems to have taken place between the Tigris and Mount Zagros. Both sides fought with desperate courage. Carenes carried all before him, but, advancing too far, was surprised in the rear. This decided the issue. Meherdates yielded to false promises, and was led in chains to the victor, who despised him too much to put him to death, but rendered him harmless by the amputation of his ears. But Gotarzes did not long survive his victory. He was succeeded, in summer 51 A.D., by Vonones II., king of Media, who was followed, after a reign of a few months, by his son Vologases I., a capable and successful ruler. 51 to 78 A.D. One of the chief ends of the policy of Vologases was to recover Armenia, and an opportunity was soon offered through an act of foul treachery on the part of the Iberian king. Pharasmanes had a son named Radamistus, tall, handsome, of remarkable bodily strength, trained in archery and riding, and the other accomplishments of his countrymen, and of high renown among the neighbouring peoples. This ambitious youth declared too boldly his impatience of his father's long old age, which kept him out of the little kingdom which he perhaps hoped to extend. Pharasmanes, seeing that his son was prepared to grasp the power, if an occasion offered itself, tempted the youth with other prospects, and pointed to Armenia, suggesting that his brother Mithridates might be overthrown. A treacherous scheme was devised. Radamistus, feigning to have quarrelled with his father, sought shelter at his uncle's court, and there engaged in treasonable intrigues with some of the Armenian nobles. When the ground was prepared, Pharasmanes declared war against his brother on some trifling plea, and supplied his son with an army, with which he invaded and occupied Armenia. 52 A.D. Mithridates placed himself under the protection of the Roman garrison of the fortress of Gorneus, which was commanded by Caelius Pollio. Radamistus blockaded the place, and, unable to take it, attempted to bribe Pollio. But Gasparius, a centurion, who held a secondary command, protested, and having arranged a truce, proceeded to Pharasmanes to induce him to withdraw the army. Pharasmanes replied in a conciliatory manner, but by secret messages urged Radamistus to hurry on the siege. A large bribe was offered to Pollio, who seems to have been a man of bad character. He bribed the soldiers to threaten to abandon the place unless terms were made with the besiegers, and the unfortunate Mithridates was compelled to surrender. Radamistus at first rushed into his embrace, greeted him as his parent, and feigned the deepest respect. He even swore an oath that he would offer him no violence either by sword or by poison. He then drew him into a neighbouring grove, where he said that preparations had been made for the sacrifice which should confirm peace in the presence of the gods. It was the custom of these princes when they met to form an alliance, to join their right hands and tie together their thumbs in a tight knot. Then, when the blood was collected into the extremities which were thus tied, they let it out by a small puncture, and sucked it each in turn. The treaty had thus a mystical sanctity, being sealed by the blood of both. On this occasion, the man who was tying the knot pretended to fall, and seizing the knees of Mithridates, flung him down. A number of people then rushed upon him and loaded him with chains. He was dragged along, subject to all kinds of indignities, while his wife and little children followed, wailing. They were hidden in covered wagons until the will of Pharasmanes as to their fate should be made known. To him the desire of kingdom was more than his brother and his daughter, and his heart was steeled to crimes. But he spared his eyes the sight of a brother's execution. Radamistus, to keep the letter of his oath, used neither steel nor poison against his uncle and his sister, but had them thrown on the ground and smothered under a load of heavy clothes. Even the sons of Mithridates were slaughtered for having wept at the murder of their father and mother. Ummidius Quadratus, the legatus of Syria, on whom it devolved to watch the course of events in the neighbouring dependent kingdoms, decided not to interfere. He or his councillors judged it to be a matter of indifference whether Armenia was ruled by the uncle or by the nephew, and the principle was asserted that all crime in a foreign land was to be received with joy. It was the policy of Rome to sow strife among the barbarians, and it was rather for her interest that the hated Radamistus should retain what he had got by such an infamous deed, inasmuch as he would be more easily managed. At the same time, appearances were kept up by sending an embassy to Pharasmanes, bidding him and his son evacuate Armenia. A show of interference was also made by Julius Pelignus, the procurator of Cappadocia, a man of deformed body and feeble intellect who had been a sort of buffoon at the court of Claudius. There were no military forces stationed in Cappadocia at this time, but Pelignus collected some native militia and set forth to recover Armenia. His men deserted their incompetent leader, and he, finding himself defenceless, went to Radamistus, whose gifts had such an effect that Pelignus actually urged him to assume the tiara and diadem of royalty, and take part in the coronation of the usurper whom he had come to expel. This disgraceful act caused great scandal, and lest other Romans should be judged by the behaviour of Pelignus, Quadratus sent a certain Helvidius Priscus with one of the Syrian legions to restore order. But this force was speedily withdrawn in order to avoid a collision with the Parthians. For in the meantime Vologeses, judging the moment to be favourable, and supposing that the Romans would not trouble themselves to support Radamistus, had named his brother Tiridates king of Armenia, and had entered the country with an army. 53 A.D. The Iberians were expelled without a blow, and the two chief cities, Artaxata and Tigranocerta, submitted to the Parthian yoke. A severe winter, want of provisions, and the breaking out of a disease in his army compelled Vologeses to retire, and Radamistus speedily returned and dealt out vengeance to those who had deserted him. But his subjects rebelled against his cruelty, and an armed crowd gathered round his palace in Artaxata. He and his wife Zenobia were obliged to flee, and the story of their escape is romantic. Their chance of safety lay in the swiftness of their horses, but Zenobia was pregnant, and, though she endured somehow or other the first part of the flight, she was after a while so shaken by the continuous galloping that she could hold out no longer, and dismounting she begged her husband to rescue her from the insults of captivity by an honourable death. Radamistus was at length induced to comply with her request. Unsheathing his short sabre, the Asonaces, he stabbed her, and dragging her to the bank of the Araxes, committed her to the stream, that even her dead body might be rescued from the enemy. He then continued his headlong flight, and reached Iberia in safety. But Zenobia was not mortally wounded. She lay in the calm water near the edge of the river, breathing and showing signs of life. Some shepherds observed her, and seeing from her appearance that she was a woman of high degree, bound up her wound and applied rustic remedies. Having discovered her name and story, they took her to Artaxata, whence she was led to Tiridates, now established as king of Armenia, who received her kindly, and treated her as a queen. 54 A.D. Some desultory warfare was kept up between Tiridates and Radamistus during the first year of Claudius, 54 A.D. The Parthians were at this time trammelled by revolts in the north of their empire, and the Romans were busied with the suppression of a rising of the Clitae in Cilicia, and with troubles in Judaea. The Armenians, disgusted at the countenance which the Romans had given to the usurpation of Radamistus, were by no means dissatisfied at the establishment of a Parthian prince in their country. The success of Tiridates seemed to be one more proof that the policy of Augustus was not likely to lead to a stable settlement of the Eastern question. The death of Claudius and the accession of Nero was a good opportunity for trying a new policy. The government of Nero, conducted by Seneca and Burrus, decided to take active measures for the recovery of Armenia and the maintenance of Rome's prestige, which had been dimmed by the recent triumph of Vologases and his brother. The first step was the appointment of Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo to the government of Cappadocia, with the rank of a consular legatus, although that province had been hitherto under a procurator. He was consul in 39 A.D. We have already met him as legatus of Lower Germany, 47 A.D., where he gained a high reputation for discipline and ability. Quadratus was allowed to keep his post in Syria, but was ordered to place 2 of his 4 legions at the disposal of the new legatus of Cappadocia. Antiochus of Commagene and Herod Agrippa II of Chalcis received commands to have their troops in readiness for operations against the Parthians. Lesser Armenia and Sophene, the countries which bordered Armenia on the west, were entrusted to 2 Syrian princes, Aristobulus and Sohemus respectively. But the legions had become demoralized by a long peace, and they liked little to change their quarters in Syria for the mountains of Armenia. There were veterans in the army who had never served on sentinel duty, to whom the rampart and the ditch were novelties, men without helmets or breastplates, sleek traders who had served all their time in towns. The first thing that Corbulo had to do was to dismiss a large number of incapable men and levy new recruits. Even after the restoration of discipline, he was obliged to ask for additional troops from the more efficient armies of the west. A legion and auxiliaries were sent from Germany, but Rome did not immediately come to blows with Parthia. Instead of invading Armenia, Corbulo entered into negotiations with Vologases, and a treaty was concluded. The Parthians undertook to give hostages as a pledge of peace, while the Romans suffered the rule of Tiridates in Armenia. Perhaps this was only for the purpose of gaining time. But it may be that the Roman government had come to see the uselessness of continually setting up kings of their own choice in Armenia, destined to be overthrown in a few years by Parthian rivals. So as they were not prepared to annex that country as a province, they decided to adopt the policy of recognizing the Parthian candidate, on the understanding that he held his dependency under the overlordship of the Roman emperor, not of the Parthian monarch. But as time went on, and Tiridates still demurred to receive Armenia as a Roman gift, and take an oath of allegiance to the emperor, Corbulo set out in 57 A.D., 2 years after his appointment, with an army of about 30,000 men, and wintered in Armenia. The rigor of Armenian winters was proverbial, and the army seems to have suffered severely. The ground covered with ice yielded no place for the tents until it was regularly dug up. The cold was so intense that many of the men had their limbs frostbitten, others perished on guard. A soldier carrying a bundle of wood was observed, whose hands dropped off and fell with the burden. Corbulo was glad to give his demoralized soldiers the experience of hardships. He is described as going about among his men, lightly clad, with uncovered head, praising the brave, encouraging the weak, enforcing strict discipline. Deserters were put to death for the first offense. The end of chapter 18, part 1. Recording by Mark Penfold.